Let me introduce Dr. Jeff Mallinson, who will talk about religion and the Founding Fathers.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome. As Ben mentioned, today is Constitution Day, so happy Constitution Day, a hallmark day throughout the year. As Ben said, on this day, 228 years ago, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the Constitution and sent it to the Confederation Congress with the hope that the Congress would then pass it on to the states, which it obviously did. We still enjoy that Constitution today, or not enjoy it, as the case may be. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in the United States in portraying America's founding fathers as men of deep religious faith, as having founded a Christian nation. This view is especially prevalent among Christian conservatives, many evangelicals, and certain Republican presidential candidates. They argue that the Christian foundation acts as a justification for a variety of political stances that they take. We see this today in debates over gay marriage, Planned Parenthood, and the Affordable Care Act, meaning that the question of the Founding Fathers and their religion has important 21st century ramifications. As a historian, I specialize in the founders and their legacies, and I think that we use them far too much to justify modern politics and policies. Don't get me wrong. We definitely have things we can learn from the founders. But unfortunately, in today's society, the people trying to decide on the lessons we should be learning are the people least equipped to understand what those lessons should actually be. The primary purpose of this talk is to help you to better understand the context in which the founders confronted and understood religion and its relationship to American government. Once you understand that context, it becomes much easier to assess for yourself the validity of the arguments that people make about the founders and religion. And that, more than anything else, is really my goal today, to give you a baseline of understanding that will help you to assess for yourselves the claims put forward by politicians, government officials, Facebook commenters, and others. First, before we get to anything else, we have to ask the question, what do we mean by context? Historians understand context as understanding the past in relationship to conditions as they existed at the time being studied. We have to recognize that conditions change over time. Society changes over time. And in order to properly understand an historical figure, an historical event, or an historical concept, we need to reconstruct the conditions in which that person acted, that event took place, or that concept was utilized. The changing of social norms, social expectations, and social constraints directly impacts the way we understand the past in general. Let me give you a few quick, largely modern, and basic examples to help illustrate this point of the importance of understanding context. If any of you are baseball fans out of there, we cannot blindly compare home run totals from the 1990s and early 2000s with those of the 1960s. The context of the league, the nature of the game, the height of the mound, the understanding of nutrition and weight training, the prevalence of smoking in the 60s, the prevalence of steroids in the 90s. All of this means that the game was essentially an entirely different game that you can't just compare blindly without attributing context and trying to normalize for these differences. In general, these same issues hold true for all sports discussions if you try and compare sports over time. If any of you have been paying attention to the conversation about concussions in football, you see this issue of bigger, faster, stronger, steroids, human growth hormone, and the rest clearly influencing the prevalence of concussions. You cannot watch a science fiction movie made in the 1950s and fault it for not having modern special effects. In the realm of history, the easiest to understand element of context is that of slavery. Slavery was certainly a deplorable institution, but we learn nothing about slavery by using 21st century morality to pass judgment on 18th century slaveholders. We have to understand slavery in the context of the time it existed if we actually want to understand or learn anything significant about slavery itself. This isn't to say that context justifies deplorable institutions, but we don't learn anything by just giving in to, oh, it was a deplorable institution. Before we look specifically at the religious context of the Founding Fathers, I want to talk about the historical context of the founders themselves, how we need to situate them in general. What our nation's Founding Fathers share in common is that they participated in historically significant acts of founding. They signed the Declaration of Independence, they fought in the American Revolution, they served in the Continental Congress, they helped to give life to the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, or they participated in the ratification debates of 1787-88, or they served in the early years of the new government created by the Constitution. What our nation's founding fathers do not share in common, are their specific beliefs about much of anything. Grouping them together as founding fathers does something of a disservice to history by presenting them as being a group of like-minded individuals moving together for the collective good of the nation. Yet that is not really what they were doing at all. It's not really how they thought of themselves at all. Each man had a perspective on the country and its interests directly shaped by his own personal experience as an inhabitant of a particular colony and then state with particular economic, religious, cultural interests and influences. If you read the debate surrounding the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the Constitution in 1787, if you read the debates in the Confederation Congress in the 1780s about import duties and foreign affairs, if you read the debates in the first federal Congresses regarding Alexander Hamilton's financial plans and the adoption of a national bank, you see these significant competing interests clearly being put on display and clearly influencing how they were trying to shape this nation. As an American people, we are so conditioned to think about this generation as the founding generation in capital letters that we have trouble appreciating how truly divided they were on most questions. And even when we can recognize division, such as that between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, we are so conditioned to think about politics as a two-party affair that we have trouble isolating the multiplicity of views that were actually being expressed in this period. To put all of this in potentially a much simpler way, the Founding Fathers had fundamentally different perspectives and opinions on what it was that they were even founding. Some of these same problems present themselves when we consider religion and the founders. Arguments about their religion often present a false dichotomy. Either they were amongst the most religious people that ever lived, or they were practically atheists, with little room in between. But the reality is that the founders practiced many different religions to varying degrees of devotion. In the 21st century in the United States, religion is diverse and varied in prominence. Different parts of the country are more and less religious, more and less overt in their religiosity, and there are a multiplicity of faiths present in most communities. A place like Fort Wayne is an excellent example of this. Fort Wayne is more religious than many parts of the country, with churches for a variety of mostly Christian denominations virtually everywhere you look. But there are still plenty of people who do not practice or do not believe. And society generally accepts all of this. The situation was very different in the world of the American founding, in some ways, and in some ways it's actually quite similar. In the 18th century, the 13 colonies that would become the United States were the most Protestant place in the world, but were also the most religiously diverse place in the world, due to the sheer number of different Protestant denominations that existed in the 13 colonies. Most colonies tended to feature a dominant religion, though. In New England, and especially in Massachusetts, the dominant religion was the Congregational Church, which was a descendant of the earlier Puritan Church. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers. Maryland had a large concentration of Catholics, although they were a minority of the population. Virginia and many of the other southern colonies were primarily Anglican, meaning that they belonged to the Church of England, and then after the Revolution they became Episcopalians. Several colonies still featured formal religious establishments by the time of the American Revolution. And by religious establishment, we mean state-sponsored religion. Tax revenues, for example, in Massachusetts went to directly support the Congregational Church. In Virginia, they supported the Anglican Church. Colonists were free to practice other religions if they so chose, but they were still taxed to support the established church. Thus, in the First Amendment to the Constitution, when it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, this is what they were referring to. that there should no longer be state-sponsored religion, at least on the national level. It's important to note that the First Amendment only applied to the federal government when it went into place. It was not until the adoption of the 14th Amendment in 1868, and then really some effort by the Supreme Court in the early 20th century, that made the First Amendment applicable to all governments. The level of religious devotion on display in the colonies experienced a series of peaks and valleys in the 18th century. In the 1730s and 1740s, we witness a peak with the Great Awakening, a spread of evangelical fervor throughout the colonies. But by the 1770s and 1780s, the period of the American Revolution, we see that religion in most places had lost some of its influence. We see one of these valleys. This was a point of concern to many at the time of the Revolution. The fear was that without religion, virtue and moral order would disappear. If people didn't go to church on Sundays, it meant that they instead would be going to horse races, they'd be going to bars, they'd be gambling, and they'd be drinking. They'd be engaging in a variety of unpious behavior. The concern was not just about faith, but social order. The United States was built upon the virtue of the citizenry. Republicanism and democracy could not work in a society that lacked virtue. The widespread belief was that religion is what taught virtue and morality in the United States. Many could not readily envision a society that lacked religion but still preserved virtue. Thus, if you see religion disappearing, virtue is going to disappear. If virtue disappears, republicanism, democracy, United States government in general crumbles. This is obviously critically important in understanding the importance that this generation did attach to religion in general. There are two critically important pieces of context that we need to understand in order to properly situate the founders and their religions. First, evangelicals and other people of faith generally did not try to exert influence in the world of politics and government at this point in time, especially not on the level of proposing or opposing particular laws based on this Bible verse or that church teaching. Evangelicals, people who became born again and were often the most ardent and outspoken in their religious beliefs in this period, and really today as well, wanted to practice freely and see their sects attain an equal status in society. But otherwise, they left the civil government to its own devices. The second point of context is that American society, as much as there was an American society at this point, most people still readily identified with their colony and state, much more so than they identified with any abstract concept of America. American society, though, was simultaneously more religious, but also less overtly religious than what we experience today. While many Americans in the late 18th century did not actively practice their faith, the vast majority still identified themselves as belonging to one Christian denomination or another. The categories of atheist and agnostic were not readily available at that point, and while there were a small number of Jewish people in the United States, other non-Christian religions were generally not present or not recognized. Today, the vast majority of Americans, at least based upon every poll and assessment, every survey I've ever seen, still profess a belief in God in one form or another. For some, it might be the flying spaghetti monster, but that is still a God. Today, though, religion is also much more varied in the United States. We've seen a significant rise in non-Christian religions and in agnostics, although atheists are generally seen as being a destabilizing influence in society. Recently, I saw one really interesting poll which said that more Americans would be willing to vote for a homosexual for president than they would be willing to vote for an atheist for president. That's not a commentary on homosexuality or atheism. It's just an interesting fact about the American people. Overt religiosity in the public sphere is also very different today than it was in the late 18th century, both in terms of politicians today putting their religious credentials on display as part of public appeals, and also conservatives framing most social issues around a particular interpretation of the Bible. Now that we've established the larger religious context of the founding era, we can consider religion and the founders themselves. In many cases, The religious beliefs of individual historical actors are actually quite hard to accurately assess or to fully assess. Religion is fundamentally a personal question. It's an internal aspect of life. There's going to be a significant difference potentially between the degree to which someone is a true believer versus the outward actions or declarations that they take or make. Certainly people's religious beliefs or the degree of their religious fervor is going to change over time, and that might not necessarily make it into the historical record. And then perhaps most importantly, whereas today we have an extremely active and invasive media presence, even if you want to refer to Twitter as a form of media, where it's virtually impossible for a candidate for office to not have their religious views announced and dissected and redissected and complained about and debated about and everything else. But in the late 18th century, early 19th centuries, there was no invasive media. This wasn't an issue of popular concern except for a very few small cases, most importantly having to do with Thomas Jefferson and allegations that he was an atheist. What this means is that while we can speak about the religious views of the founders, in many cases we are making arguments based upon incomplete evidence. And thus we have to be especially careful about reading our own personal biases and beliefs into the historical record. And this is where many a historian and many a historian have fallen down on the job. They have a particular view and they readily read that into the incomplete record. So, for the founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin were generally not very religious. At various points in time in their lives, some of them practiced to some degree or another, but by the 1780s and 1790s, none of these men were active participants in any sort of true religious life. John Adams was the most devout of the major founders, although even he had some problems with organized religion in the direction it was moving by the late 18th century. But there were many other members of the founding generation who were deeply religious and earnestly religious. But after having spent more years than I'd like to admit examining the papers of the Founding Fathers, reading books, reading manuscripts, reading newspapers about this period, I can honestly tell you without bias that whether or not someone was religious was kind of besides the point in this period in terms of how they understood the founding of the United States. And that kind of is the point when attempting to assess the founders and their religion, or the role that religion played in the founding more generally. As I indicated previously, most political leaders in this era recognized that religion played a valuable role in society when it came to the preservation of public morals and virtue. But otherwise, religion was a private matter that had no place in the public sphere. And to be clear, by public sphere in this context, I mean the world of politics and government, not public civil society more generally. We see these distinctions between public and private spheres, between morals versus religious dogma, manifest themselves in interesting ways in the early republic. George Washington, our first president, president of the Constitutional Convention before that, commander-in-chief of the Confederation Army, father of his country, important dude. In October 1789, about half a year into his first term as president, George Washington issued a proclamation calling for a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. The first line of that proclamation read, "Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor." And then he went on to proclaim this day of thanksgiving and prayer. Clearly, this language recognizes an important role of God and religion more generally in the life of the nation. And in fact, Washington featured this kind of language in many public statements and throughout his private correspondence. On the one hand, this language is kind of very overtly pro-God. But at the same time, if you look at this carefully, and if you look at the rest of Washington's other writings on religion carefully, it's also exceedingly generic. Some scholars have taken to describing this kind of religious language, both in historical and in modern contexts, as representing non-sectarian monotheism, which is a really fancy word for saying we're not proposing, we're not advocating any particular religious sect, religious denomination, but we are generally supporting the idea of a unitary God, of a single God. And in the language Washington used, he was not advocating a particular religion, but instead he was articulating general religious beliefs. And if you really step back and look at the language for a moment, this language isn't even automatically articulating Christian beliefs. In fact, much of the language of the founders used to describe the United States and the divine providence that had safeguarded them had no explicitly Christian content behind it. Deism was growing in popularity at this point in time, and while for a period of time there was many historians were trying to go through and reclassify all of the founders as being deists, many have kind of moved away from that association by this point, but as an intellectual movement there was this non-Christian, non-sectarian, monotheistic idea traveling throughout the intellectual world at this point in time, in the 1780s, 1790s. We get further insight into Washington's views on religion in a letter he wrote to the, quote, Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, in August of 1790. Rhode Island had just recently ratified the Constitution, and so Washington traveled personally to the state to thank them for, joining the Union, joining the United States. And while he was there, a Jewish congregation in Newport greeted him, talked to him, and so he felt it necessary to respond in writing to what they had said. He actually responded in writing to every group that addressed him. And what he wrote was this: "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." Now, as a larger historical question, it was significant that Washington was writing these lines to a people of the Jewish faith, as Jews throughout Europe and America at this point in world history were generally not accorded equal rights in most societies. But what Washington was stressing here was that he didn't much care about their particular religious beliefs. Everyone had the right to practice religion as they saw fit, and this practice of religion had virtually nothing to do with their contributions to American society at large. As long as they acted as good citizens, they would be accorded the rights of citizens. So essentially, Washington in this quote is emphasizing the distinct spheres that existed between government and religion. In these quotes, we see that Washington believed that religion had a role to play in society and in the life of the nation. But the truth was, if we actually look carefully at Washington's writings, if we actually look carefully at his diaries, if we actually look carefully at his life, the truth was that Washington himself was not very religious. The best evidence we have suggests that Washington did not regularly, if ever, go to church. He did not write about religion in any specific way, and despite lots of references to God, he does not a single time in any of his correspondence or public speeches mention Jesus, ever. Thomas Jefferson described Washington in this way, quote, "Even as he injected a religious vocabulary in public statements, he was not a Christian by any definition." Thomas Jefferson is inarguably the most controversial founder when it comes to the question of religious belief. Academic historians have long recognized that Jefferson was deeply ambivalent about, if not downright hostile to, organized religion. But there have been multiple efforts in the last 30 years to Christianize Jefferson, culminating in David Barton's largely discredited 2012 book, The Jefferson Lies. To describe Jefferson as a Christian in any active sense of the word, and more to our point here, to suggest that Jefferson wanted to use government power to advance Christian religion in the United States, represents a tortured reading of the evidence that we have available to us. And let me share some of the evidence that we do have. In 1779, while serving in the Virginia legislature, Jefferson introduced a bill for establishing religious freedom. Later in life, Jefferson would describe this as one of his 4 most important accomplishments in a very accomplished life. This bill for establishing religious freedom represented a marked change for Virginia, where the Anglican Church had long been formally established. The more popular nod to the presence of other religious groups in Virginia had been to endorse religious tolerance. We will tolerate your presence, but we will not treat you equally. We will still make you pay taxes to support a church to which you do not belong. Jefferson instead wanted complete religious freedom, which meant no establishment and the equal treatment of all religions. It meant government getting out of the business of advocating on behalf of any particular religion. As Jefferson described it, the bill for establishing religious freedom guaranteed complete religious freedom for, quote, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. This was a more complete vision of religious freedom than Washington's non-sectarian monotheism implied. As president, Jefferson did not proclaim days of Thanksgiving because he refused to use the government to issue the kind of religious language, even if generic in nature, that Washington had. Jefferson's most famous statement on religion in the United States was his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Religion was a matter of personal conviction, or as Jefferson frames it, personal opinion. It was a matter that, in order to protect religion from government interference, had to be kept entirely separate from government. As Jefferson understood this concept then, the government could not interfere with religion in the United States, and the government likewise could not be used to advocate religion in the United States. To mix the two threatened to jeopardize both of them. One final quote from Jefferson helps to illustrate how he drew the lines between public and private, morals and dogma. This one from a letter he wrote in 1809 but ultimately did not send because he did not personally know the person he was sending it to and feared that his words would be more widely disseminated than he would have liked. Oftentimes letters from prominent individuals were published in the newspapers whether they gave their approval or not in this period. We all agree in the obligation of the moral precepts of Jesus, but we schismatize and lose ourselves in subtleties about his nature, his conception, maculate or immaculate, whether he was a god or not a god, whether we are to use our own reason or the reason of others in the opinions we form. It is time to become sensible how insoluble these questions are by minds like ours, how unimportant and how mischievous. In this quote, we can see one of the roots of Jefferson's dislike of organized religion. His was an Enlightenment mind, and while he appreciated the moral precepts that Jesus could teach, he fundamentally did not understand why mankind would cease to think for itself, why it would simply accept inherited wisdom, or why it would sign up for all of the hatred, violence, and destruction that resulted from sectarian difference. Historian Andrew Burstein, who recently published a really excellent book about Jefferson, described Jefferson's views on religion thusly. To sum up Jefferson's long-held assessment of religion, it was this: morals well taught make the world a better place. Dogmas aggressively promoted inhibit the honest pursuit of knowledge. Believe what you want, just try not to be stupid. And don't let others think for you. If there is a God, no human can affect to know his mind, so what good is there in trying to enforce belief? I want to conclude with James Madison and the First Amendment to the Constitution. Madison wasn't quite as hostile to organized religion as Jefferson was, but he was just as strong a proponent of religious liberty and the separation of church and state. Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom was not adopted by the Virginia legislature in 1779. But Madison saw to it that it was reintroduced in the 1780s, and ultimately that it was adopted by Virginia in 1785. as part of a larger effort to once and for all get the Virginia government to stop meddling in religious affairs. After the statute's passage, Madison wrote to Jefferson declaring, "I flatter myself that the people of Virginia have extinguished forever the ambitious hope of making laws for the human mind." Religious liberty then was not just about the freedom to practice one's religion free from government interference. It was also about intellectual freedom. On the national level, Madison was the person most responsible for the country's adoption of the Bill of Rights. You can probably not really see it, but that's an original written version of the Bill of Rights. During the first session of the First Federal Congress, Madison proposed a list of 17 possible amendments to the Constitution. He'd pulled these together from the various ratification debates, proposals that states had made in the previous years. Madison's proposal called for incorporating these amendments directly into the text of the Constitution, so in many ways actually going through and rewriting the Constitution to incorporate some new protections and new ideas. His fourth proposal inserted new text between the third and fourth clauses of Article 1, Section 9, and read, "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed." We see in this language the separation of church and state on the one hand, and the distinction between a person's rights of religion and rights of conscience, and a person's civil rights on the other. Shortly after the debate started, and it's kind of amazing how quickly Congress actually debated these 17 amendments and reframed them into 12 and then ultimately sent those to the states. Given how much importance we attached to them, they kind of very quickly moved through them. But shortly after the debate started, the proposed amendment was modified to strike out the first clause and to simply read, "No religion shall be established by law, nor shall the equal rights of conscience be infringed." And what's interesting is the debate that followed focused to a great extent on an explicit discussion of what this actually meant. They recognized that you could potentially interpret these words in a variety of different ways. In Madison's view, the words meant this, that Congress should not establish a religion and enforce the legal observation of it by law, nor compel men to worship God in any manner contrary to their conscience. Government cannot support a particular religion, it cannot compel worship, and it certainly cannot mandate the belief in specific ideas. While Washington, Jefferson, and Madison approached religion in different ways, they shared the basic belief that religion had an important role to play in society, the installation of public morals and public virtue, but otherwise had no role to play in government. I want to conclude by making 2 points that connect this historical discussion to modern-day considerations. First, there are a variety of perspectives that historians, political scientists, and legal scholars take when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. One of these perspectives is called originalism, which holds that the original intent of the people who framed and enacted the Constitution and Bill of Rights should be determinative in how we interpret these documents in the 21st century. That essentially original intent matters more than any other consideration. As a historian of the American founding, I think that originalism is both silly and arbitrary. It is wrong to judge, if it is wrong to judge 18th century actors by 21st century standards, then it is just as wrong to interpret 21st century laws using 18th century beliefs. This is especially the case when there were no universally held beliefs amongst the founders, except for the one where the only people who mattered in society were white men with property. If we want to go back to that status quo, then certainly use the founders to tell us what our laws mean today. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Second, even if you do want to go back to the 1780s and 1790s to derive a deeper understanding of how the founders understood the country they had created, this originalist perspective cannot be used to support an argument that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Because as we have seen, while the founders valued religion as a stabilizing force in the United States, they ultimately also viewed it as being entirely separate from their new Constitution and their new government. Thank you. I will now gladly take some questions.
Can I ask one, Jeff? I'll get the
Sure.
ball rolling. Maybe feel free to reframe the question, but is your sense in the First Amendment that they were attempting to protect religion from government or government from religion? Or is it neither of the two?
So Dr. Gates was asking, is the First Amendment trying to protect government from religion or protect religion from government, or neither? I would actually say it's trying to do both. There was one of the real concerns amongst, when you actually go back and read the debates surrounding the First Amendment, one of the legitimate concerns being expressed by some congressmen was a fear that the language of the First Amendment was potentially trying to outlaw religion in the United States entirely. And some of the various different forms that the wording took, some took when it said that Congress shall establish no religion, they actually took that to mean that Congress is going to declare that religion is against the law. And so they wanted to make sure that the amendment couldn't be interpreted that way, that it was making clear that no, in fact, you're free to do whatever you want with religion. But I think they also recognized that they didn't want the government playing an active role in advocating certain religions. They didn't necessarily want religions constantly coming to them and asking them to make this change or take this step or do this different thing. I mean, one of the experiences they'd had in Virginia, one of the experiences Madison had in Virginia, was that as they were amending their laws regarding the religious establishment, for a period of time they did away with the formal establishment of the Anglican Church as the formal church of the state. But what they tried to do is essentially say they established a religious assessment where everyone would be taxed, and then the state would then give money out to formally recognized religions. So it wasn't just we're going to have one recognized religion. The state will now recognize a series of individual religions and will give money to them. This was kind of supposed to be the compromise of we're going to allow, we recognize the value religion has in society, but we don't want to favor any particular religion. And Madison said that's just silly because then we're going to spend the rest of our lives with each religion coming to us looking for recognition. Government's going to have to constantly interject a value statement about this religion versus that religion, how much money do we give each religion, and all of these other things. And they believed that that was entirely inappropriate. And so it really was both, I think. I see it as both trying to protect religion from government interference, but also trying to protect government from religious interference.
When did the process of swearing on the Bible by the president, when was that introduced?
So the question is, when did the process of swearing the president in on the Bible introduced? My recollection is that George Washington was sworn in on the Bible. The idea of taking an oath before God, putting your hand on the Bible as you wouldn't swear, you wouldn't lie on the Bible, you wouldn't violate an oath sworn on the Bible, that was around from the very beginning. And again, this speaks to, saying the founders didn't want religion to be part of government doesn't mean the founders didn't value religion. And I hope that point was made clear throughout the talk, because I tried to make it repeatedly if you didn't notice. And so they did see that, they did make that connection. It was part of their society. So that's been around since the beginning. Dr. Butz.
So I really like the point you were making that there's just not a lot of evidence to make conclusions, to draw sort of conclusions about what individual attitudes were.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, one of the big issues is like religion in public life and school prayer, prayer in public spaces, these kinds of things. Is there any evidence in the historical record about like what they thought about that, like in a Continental Congress? What, did they open it with a prayer, that kind of thing? Are there pieces of evidence we can use to think about those questions?
I mean, the most direct analogy is that halfway through the Constitutional Convention, 2/3 of the way through the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin of all people, and Franklin was an Enlightenment mind. He wasn't big on any particular religion, on organized religion. Ben Franklin actually proposed, why don't we have a chaplain come in every day and we'll start our sessions off with a prayer. maybe this would get us in a better mindset. Maybe this would get us moving in a positive direction. And pretty much everyone voted against that, so they didn't want to introduce that. And again, this wasn't a knock against the general idea of religion, but they didn't want to start having to, well, what denomination should that pastor be? What prayer should he say? It just opens up a can of worms that they didn't want to deal with.
They wanted to pay me.
That's probably true. And so I think the larger message you can take from that is the problem with school prayer isn't the acknowledgement of religion and a role it might have to play in society, but it's by picking what that prayer is going to be, you're privileging one religion over another. You're privileging potentially one interpretation over another. But more generally, you're privileging Christianity, because in most, you're not going to read a Muslim prayer in most schools, I wouldn't think, in the United States. You're privileging Christianity over other religious groupings. And that's where you run into the problem. And I think the Jefferson's comments about the purpose of the bill for establishing religious freedom, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the infidel and the whatever the last one was, it really is about equal access for everyone, recognizing equally everyone's rights to conscience. And if you privilege one religion or one grouping over everyone else, then you're actually denying religious freedom. Yes?
I had a question about resistance to this from different states, because you've talked about already that some were established by certain religious sects, or like Williams in Rhode Island, was he saying, look, the whole reason we did our own place is so we could practice our religion freely? Were they content with like letting everybody else practice theirs too, or was there some resistance?
I mean, it's interesting because one of America's big myths is that the people coming to America were in search of religious freedom, and that wasn't actually the case. The first English colonists to settle in North America were Virginians who were looking for profit. They were looking for money. They just established the Anglican Church in America. The Puritans wanted the freedom to practice their religion, and if you weren't a Puritan, they kicked you out. Actually, according to Massachusetts law for most of the 17th century, the King of England himself was not technically welcome in Massachusetts because he was an Anglican and not a Puritan. Roger Williams argued, and he was a very early Puritan pastor in Massachusetts, Williams argued all religions should be allowed and welcomed, except for the Quakers. I hate the Quakers. The Quakers eventually say all religions should be welcome. So there were early Americans, there were colonists who gave into this idea of, embraced this idea of religious freedom. But it kind of was slow to catch on in many parts of the colonies. Massachusetts was the state that held on to a religious establishment the longest, which is somewhat ironic given that I'm from Massachusetts. Massachusetts is probably one of the least religious states in the country today, at least overtly religious states. Massachusetts held on to the formally established Congregational Church until 1833. All right, so 50 years after the Constitution almost. But when you look at the discussion surrounding that, it was clear that the American people were more firmly embracing both the importance of freedom of religion, but they were also embracing this separation of church and state. Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he's a Frenchman who comes over in the late 1820s, early 1830s. In name, he's doing a study of prisons in America to bring back to France. In reality, he's kind of being punished by the French government for a variety of things we don't need to talk about. And so they kind of send him into exile for a couple of years. But he writes this book, Democracy in America, which is an observation about a whole series of things in America. And one of the things that Tocqueville observes in America at this point, in the late 1820s, early 1830s, is that religion is stronger in America. Religion has a stronger hold on the American people than it does anywhere in Europe. And the reason for that is because of the complete separation of church and state. That because religion and government are not intertwined, you don't have the two of them weakening each other. When religion and state are intertwined, what happens is people who don't subscribe to the state religion don't subscribe to the government. And so when you separate them, you actually strengthen both in their relative spheres, which kind of almost has nothing to do with your question, but I think is an interesting point connected to this.
Why did Jefferson feel the need to revise the Bible?
That's a good question. Jefferson went through the Bible and he kind of cut out a series of passages and pasted them together in a fun little book for himself that in the early 20th century was published as the Jefferson Bible. And interestingly enough, it was published by the US government printing office, which some Americans point to and say, look, Christian government. What Jefferson was doing there is he was pulling out all of the passages from the Bible that he believed revealed Jesus as a human and Jesus as a rationally acting human. So one of the quotes I talked about said, we can all subscribe to the moral precepts of Jesus. And that's the version of Jesus he was trying to preserve in this Jefferson Bible. A human Jesus, a rational Jesus, a moral Jesus, not a Jesus of miracles and dogma and a particular religious point of view. And so I was really playing into this concept of the morality of Jesus and how we can learn important lessons from that, and let's leave aside sectarian difference and all of the rest. And so really it's as much his hostility to organized religion as anything else. Dean Link.
Yeah, I really appreciated your talk, and I guess I have a couple little questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You made a couple statements during your talk of a general nature that, what we find when we look back on the founding fathers, so-called, of this era is they were in the aggregate not deeply religious individuals. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering if, as my first question, if you could talk just for a little bit about what you mean by that, because it would depend, I would think, on how you defined what it meant to be religious, right? And one way is, are they, in an external way, exhibiting the ritualistic behaviors that we associate with denominationalism, etc.? On the other hand, you could have a very different interpretation, that they act in such a way in their daily life in accordance with a set of convictions that are rooted in what we would call religion, right? And so what do you mean by that?
I would say it's more, I don't remember if it was the first thing you said or the second thing you said, but in the case of people like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, it's more that they don't practice any particular religion. But I think if you look at their writings, if you look at their conduct, if you look at the things they say, I think they all do believe strongly in this idea of the moral precepts that religion instills. All of them grew up in households where religion was a part of their lives, and they chose throughout their lives to move further away from that or whatever else. Alexander Hamilton was actually quite religious as a young man, but when he lived in the West Indies, but when he came to America, he kind of made a decision to move away from that. And so when I say they weren't deeply religious, they weren't overly religious, I mean in the outward sort of way that we can track through their comings and goings, their writings and everything else. But I think if you look at, for example, George Washington's writings, he clearly places an emphasis on the kinds of morals that religion teaches. He talks a lot about the importance of honesty and the importance of fair and just dealings with other people. He talks a lot about these kinds of this basic morality that goes hand in hand with religious instruction. He just kind of detaches it somewhat from any larger religious meaning.
I appreciate that, and if I may, that leads to my second question. When I look at some of those statements, what impresses me is how much correspondence there is between the language you think Ben Franklin's letter to Ezra Stiles, the statements by Jefferson and Washington. There's a really nice correspondence between those and like the creed established by Lord Herbert of Cherbury, by Elihu Palmer in the Deistical Society of New York, right? So rather than being, in my mind, very generic statements, they seem to me almost very poignant statements about the influence of deism, which you glossed over a little bit. So when I look at that period, I see people who were not necessarily unreligious or who tended to kind of gloss over large questions with generic statements, but instead I see statements that kind of carefully map onto some of the creeds established by the leading deist theologians of the era.
Deism is one of these things where it gets difficult It connects back to the point I made earlier in the talk about being hard to trace specific religious belief because of the nature of religious belief. Deists have a particular view of God, and they view that the possible existence of God is one thing. God, the watchmaker, he kind of sets things in motions and lets it go. But deists kind of reject the possibility of miracles and other things, and that gets into a version of belief that it's hard to more fully assess. So, for example, some historians have tried to reclassify John Adams later in life as being a deist. And John Adams is a really interesting figure in this conversation because Adams was more devout at various points in time. But Adams, as I said, also did make many statements that were kind of critical of particular aspects of religious practice and religious dogma. And so some tried to reclassify him as a deist in terms of the way he talked about religion and understood religion. But Adams did believe in miracles. He talked about his belief in miracles. He talked about seeing the hand of God in certain things in life. And so with Adams, it's easier to say, oh no, he wasn't a deist. With Jefferson, it's probably a lot easier to say he probably would believe and subscribe to that. With someone like Washington, where he offers the kind of language he does, it gets more complicated because of the things Washington does and does not say. I mean, many historians do think he probably subscribed to a certain element of deist belief, but it's hard to fully draw the line and draw the distinction. Professor Fleming, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I don't have a fully formed question, and I don't know a lot about deism, but pretty much every time I hear you speak about the early fathers, I can't stop thinking about Roman writings, which I know they were well versed in. And like I think you just had a quick statement about, you know, a life exhibiting morality, which therefore shows religion, meaning Christianity. But I mean, Romans write endlessly about morality, and the end result is essentially the same morality. Mm-hmm. But you know, they on the surface believed in multiple gods. But then, I mean, looking at the way that like Washington talks about God, sounds exactly the same way that Cicero talks about Jupiter, which is just like this abstract. You make an address when you're in the Senate, but in reality, your morality comes from your philosophical leanings that don't have any real connection to a particular religion. And for that matter, all this Roman stuff predating Christianity. I don't think there's a question there. I mean, just a thought. I wonder if you had any thoughts about the role. And I'm sure, like I said, I don't know a lot about deism, but I'm sure they're certainly reading Cicero and being influenced by his sense of morality, a morality that has nothing to do with a particular religious creed.
Well, see, what's interesting is that some of them would have been reading Cicero. Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton would have been reading Cicero in Latin, and they would have been reading texts in Greek when they were in school, and they would have been learning these things and translating these things and writing relevant passages down in books and carrying them around with them. But someone like Washington would not necessarily have been exposed to that nearly as much because he didn't have nearly as much in the way of formal education. And so, but I think you're right that it speaks to, for the Romans, it was one set of philosophy, it was one set of doctrines. For the Americans, the English colonists, it was a different set of doctrines. It was a different set of a larger philosophical belief, a larger philosophical system that is giving shape to what they're understanding. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that we talk about morality and virtue, and their understanding of morality and virtue is very much a Christian understanding of morality and virtue. But that Christian understanding isn't fundamentally different from, as they understood it in the 1780s, isn't fundamentally different from what it would have been earlier. And I'm sure people like Madison saw the larger connections. Madison writes at length in the 1780s about earlier confederations and earlier governmental systems and what the people were like and how they contributed to or undermined the success or failure of these systems. And so as much as there wasn't a question there wasn't necessarily an answer here, but I think you do see this larger framework of it, just kind of the philosophical place in which these people lived. They're trying to pull some deeper meaning that will shape the way we understand how society is supposed to work and the interaction between the people within it. Yes?
I wondered how much, if at all, what the founders were thinking about was potentially also in response to what was going on in Europe and the relationship of the church and the government in Europe?
I mean, to a certain extent, it is a direct response to not wanting their country to be that. But I think the other piece of it is it's a more practical recognition that when they come together to form a United States, they cannot impose a particular religious viewpoint because there is not a universally held religious viewpoint. The peoples of the different colonies, now the different states, have dramatically different understandings of religion. And I think this is another important element of understanding whether or not we're a Christian nation or whatever else. While the vast majority of Americans at this point were Christian, there was no particular religion that would have actually appealed to the American people. And so on the state level, some of it is a response to what's going on in Europe. By the early 19th century, Massachusetts is really the only state that has this religious establishment that's firmly held onto. The rest of them have moved past that. The rest of them have moved towards religious freedom. And that is kind of a response to what's going on in Europe. On the larger national level, though, it's as much pragmatism as anything else.
We have time for one more question. Have one last question.
I'm wondering the extent to which the Enlightenment ideals that a lot of these guys were steeped in, how that feeds into what they thought about religion, since we've got people like Voltaire expressing what some might consider anti-religious views. How does that fit into their expression of it?
I think it's very clearly influential in someone like Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence, nature and nature's God, that's very clearly this pointing towards this natural rights philosophy, which is emerging from Enlightenment ideas. Jefferson and Madison, their whole discussion of religion, this Madison pointing to the idea of religious liberty being equated with intellectual freedom. They're very much, and Jefferson talking about thinking for yourselves, developing your own opinions, and not just accepting what is handed down from you. This is kind of classic Enlightenment 101 in terms of how they're understanding it. But again, I make the same answer to you I gave to Damien, which is that there is going to be a significant degree of variation depending on people's educational backgrounds. Washington, as a young man, wouldn't have been exposed to this nearly to the same degree that Madison and Jefferson were. And it's actually interesting on that regard that Washington in the 1780s was a proponent of religious toleration and not religious freedom. He was saying, I think toleration's fine, but I don't see why we need to go any further than that. I think we should be giving people the right to practice what they want, but as society, we're better off if we have kind of a more established thing. And so I think you do see kind of this distinction in educational background in how they kind of applied their beliefs. Now, Madison was actually instrumental in convincing Jefferson, no, toleration's bad, freedom is good, liberty is good, such that by 1789, 1790, Washington is very much on the religious liberty, religious freedom side of things and no longer on the toleration side of things. But that is their influence on each other as much because they've started talking with each other about government and policies and things like that.
Let's thank Dr. Mallinson.
Oh, thank you, everyone.
Les personnages dans mes tableaux, à me voir vivre en décroché, mes idées folles devenaient lourdes, elles avaient perdu leur portée.